Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another attire seminar at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. This seminar takes place every Thursday evening, and this week we're honored to have Rachel Spronk, who is here from University of Amsterdam. And Rachel is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. And she works at the intersection of three scholarly fields: anthropology, gender and sexuality studies, and African studies. And she combines the ethnographic study of practices and self-perceptions with the task of rethinking our theoretical repertoires. And the work that Rachel's seminar today is centering on is around a pre-circulated text, which is co-authored with Esen Nyek. And this was the introduction to a special issue of the Africa Journal. And the title of the paper is Frontiers and Pioneers in the Study of Queer Experiences in Africa. And in this paper, the two authors ask us to pay attention to the particularities of queer African experiences and paying attention to the everyday and, as I say, the particular. And just to pull out a few quotes from the paper, they quote Douglas Clark, for example, saying, "Africa has a model for queer theory that is largely unexplored in the Western world." And they also ask for advancing perspectives that are accountable to lives in Africa as producers of knowledge in practice and in theory. I was also really interested in the way they talk about people simultaneously confirming and defying gendered and sexual regimes. So thank you very much for sharing this work with us and for being here with us on the seminar. So you're going to take us through your presentation of your work for the first half, and then we'll go to discussion after that. So thank you very much for being here.
Yes, thank you, Ralph and Divine, for inviting me. And thank you for giving me a second chance, because I was already scheduled another time and then I had to leave you empty-handed. So thank you for inviting me again.
Our pleasure.
I think Ralph already mentioned the literature that I gave to read as an introduction to what I would like to say is more of an possible result of what I would like to discuss today, or a possible way out. And I would like to talk now more not only on sexuality, but on two themes where I think where there is a particular tension I would like to pay attention to in the way we study, in this case, the political economy and sexuality. And then that will lead to give me say a few things about the publication, which is only on sexuality. So I call this talk Beyond the Dark Side of Capitalism and Sexuality, because I would like to discuss a few dilemmas, or to focus on a particular tension that I think we are dealing with in studying societies or lives in Africa, but in the whole world, and which is related maybe perhaps particularly to a particular feminist or critical way of doing our work. So on the one hand, I want to focus, the tension is as follows. On the one hand, how our investment in studying the harsh dimensions of life, be it violence, conflict, hunger, disease, the effects of social injustice, how these generate very important understandings that we are after, but how, on the other hand, they also produce a particular skewed or uneven production of knowledge. So I think we are all in a way invested in how power unfolds and how power works out in our lives, and how people are differently affected depending on the position in the social fabric. And this is crucial to much of our scholarly practice, but I would like to reflect a bit on that more. And I do that by focusing on my work on the one hand, the middle classes, and on the other on sexuality. They seem to be very different matters, but I think there's a particular overlap. So first, on the middle classes, I became interested in what is now labeled the middle classes but wasn't so at all at the turn of the century when I started my PhD research. That was at the end of the 90s, a devastating AIDS epidemic was creating havoc in many societies and so on. And typically the research on AIDS revealed for me particular tendencies of how we study Africa. But not only AIDS, it's also the whole focus on the focus on poverty, on inequality and hunger, conflict, war. So because of a particular frustration, I thought I want to study a wealthier group, and that is how I came to focus on the young professionals in Nairobi. To focus on yuppies or young professionals, or what has now become called the rising middle classes, generates interesting reactions. I just want to briefly call it, we can discuss it later. So what is interesting, for example, is that in Anglo-American audiences, people can be rather dismissive of my interpretations or of the whole idea of the middle classes. They find it an unbefitting topic of research. Whereas when I present in European society, European universities or universities in different African countries, I never get that reaction, and people are more curious to know what I'm talking about. In general, I think there's a general suspicion to study the wealthier groups of society, and especially in the global south. This is, I think, because it's in direct tension with studying the nefarious impact on lives and societies from the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and to the ongoing harmful effects of neoliberal capitalism and globalization that hits people's lives, communities, and countries badly. I do not dispute this, absolutely not. But if my point is, if you look at, for example, Ghana and Kenya, two countries that I'm most familiar with, this new political economy that came in the form of the liberalization of the market after very suppressive governments, this new political economy also provided opportunities for certain groups. And this is partly where my research in Ghana focuses at, that I look at the conditions of possibility that enable people to improve their lives. So I'm interested to look at what are conditions for social mobility. And many times it's, of course, typically education, particular networks and particular resources. And I look very much at these individuals who are from poorer backgrounds, but how they manage then to climb the social ladder, so to say. Because social mobility or improving one's lives and becoming a bit wealthier, I'm not talking about elite, this is also a reality. And although it's clear that there are inequalities in rise in the way capitalism favors some and not other groups, I still think looking at social mobility or wealthier groups is an interesting take. My point is that if we only focus on poverty in the study of Africa, that creates an imbalanced image and knowledge about African societies as a whole. It excludes a part of lives. So the point is, of course, not all people in Africa are poor, but one Google Scholar search, you see that the dominance of in the literature of studies on poverty and conflict and hunger is huge. So if you look at the production of knowledge in the body of literature on Africa, it is as if the country is poor and problematic and so on. So that is kind of my point. With sexuality, there is also something like that happening. Sexuality is an interesting theme for many reasons, and it's a particularly charged topic in a way that the economy or agriculture is not. From medical abortion to acknowledging marital rape to sexual rights, these are sensitive topics where many different groups get mobilized to say something about. Sexuality is an important topic because we are all experts by experience. That is how we put it in my language, ervaringsdeskundige. We are all experts by experience, so we are personally very much engaged with it. Yet it is a notorious elusive topic to study because it's so personal, but also moral and political or very economical. Partly why gender and sexuality are so sensitive or can be so charged is that they are often seen as the foundations of our society. Gender relations and the organization of sexuality through institutions such as marriage, they are experienced as self-evident, and of course they are endorsed by religious, cultural, medical discourses that endorse normative way of gender and sexuality as natural, as biological, as the way things ought to be done. So meddling with any of these, scratching the surface of what is deemed natural, of course, arouses fierce reactions. I think we all know that. And that is why we're so interested in studying sexuality, because gender and sexuality are marked by power relations and give rise to social hierarchies and hence inequalities. As a result, there are many forms of discrimination causing suffering in all human societies. So gender-based violence, rape, sexual abuse, the ostracization of queer people, these are harrowing facts that are sometimes condoned and or explained by invoking religion, culture, norms and values, and so on. And this is exactly where we as scholars come in to explain how power works, how it naturalizes inequalities and discrimination, and how it benefits some against the expense of others. In short, studying injustice is taking responsibility, and it's taking responsibility for working towards a fairer world. Yet, there is more to sexuality than violence and abuse. And sexuality is also the realm of intimacy, of affection, of love, of fun, of bodily ecstasy, whatever. There is much more to sexuality in the way we practice it or whatever. So I think the point is that I would like to make in the literature, there's an overbearance of focusing on abuse or homophobia, and that also obscures that there are also caring families, friends, churches, and so on. So again, if you look at the literature, there's a very meager picture arising from what sexuality is about in African societies. So both the study of neoliberal capitalism and sexuality absolutely have dark sides that we must investigate. I don't dispute that. But how we have come to focus so much on the dark side has also a history, and it produces particular effects. So I think if you look generally at scholarship, it is since the 1980s that a shift has occurred by which research became increasingly more focused on power inequalities or the harsh dimensions of life. According to Robbins, the suffering subject, as she calls it, has become a primary figure, particularly in anthropological work, which is my main background. So authors like Sherry Ortner and Robbins relate this tendency on the darker side to the increasing effects of, indeed, neoliberal capitalism from the 80s onwards in the previous century. But second, also what happened at the end towards the previous century, that there is an epistemological shift where attention to issues of power and inequality and the structural and historical conditions that produce these become more grounded. So maybe to put it roughly, as a result, there's a general propensity in scholarship to identify social problems as the legitimate reason for research. This is particularly noticeable in the study of Africa, where the tendency to study social problems health concerns, and political conflicts seem to be major incentives for research, and for good reasons. Again, I do not want to dispute that. And while this generates important understandings, it's interesting to look at the effects on the production of knowledge. And I think then there are three things that I see that I would like to share with you. First, focusing on the negative or on social problems or on the darker side plays into very old images of Africa as a hopeless continent, of a place of war and hunger and problems. It also results in particular representations of Africa as a country, in the words of Binyavanga Wanaina. So it plays into existing stereotypes where Africa comes to be represented in very simplistic ways and mainly as a site of problems or conflict. Second, as I've already been explaining, the production of knowledge that comes from studying the social problems is uneven. It produces uneven or partial knowledge. For example, on sexuality, if you look at the body of literature, you would think that if you look at all the literature on sexuality and so on, that the continent is a particularly loveless place, as there is hardly any literature on the more positive sides or on intimacy and so on. And Africa is, in a way, a particularly patriarchal place where gender violence and sexual violence are rife. But while not wanting to deny that, we also have to see how it sometimes feeds into all the racist stereotypes, where stereotypes of violent men and passive female victims somehow become reproduced again or produced actually. Which, if this is the larger tendencies in the body of literature, it also informs the research agendas. And in that way, you sometimes get a particular perpetual cycle of a production of knowledge. Then third, what I would like to discuss a bit more, I don't know how much time I have left, that is that this partial knowledge also, there's a lack of differentiation in the often paradoxical nature of everyday life. In a way, lives cannot be captured in right and wrong, in domination and oppression, in free choice and restriction. Whereas focusing on injustice, somehow we write more about rightful and unrightful, harmful, and how to redress this, and then you easily talk in or fall into a pattern of right and wrong. And for example, here there's a researcher here at the University of Amsterdam who's studying the male same-sex couples in Nairobi. So two men who have a family life, who have children, who raise children, who are in a way regular, but not quite regular family in Nairobian neighborhoods. And somehow this goes unseen or unstudied because typically Kenya is being studied mostly as a place of homophobia, of violence against LGBT or queer people, and so on. So what does this tell us? That there is no literature on queer families in Kenya while they exist. That tells us that our research agendas look at particular things while unconsciously or are not including other topics. And it tells us that sometimes problems and pleasures, to put it a bit simplistic, go hand in hand. Homophobia apparently coexists with queer families. Now, that is an interesting starting point for study. So how can we explain this, what I call the production of partial knowledge? And I draw on three authors to explain, very roughly, of course, an underlying process. One is Saba Mahmoud, an anthropologist who has wrote an important book in the early 2000s. And she is interested in the practice of feminist critical thinking. And her argument is that there's a particular presumption about the liberal subject, about the persons as autonomous beings who can make decisions. And if they can't make their own decisions, they are restricted by normative or hindering structures. But this liberal subject should be free, or if it's not free, it is hindered by power. So she outlines a model of agency where somehow we fall into binaries of restriction and choice and so on, and agency where it is almost seen as a kind of resistance against powerful structures. The point is that such a model cannot account for people who transgress yet comply. And that is partly what Rolf mentioned. This is one of the themes that SN and I outline in this introduction of the special issue. People who transgress do not always overtly attack, say, dominant norms. Sometimes they comply. So how do these go hand in hand? That's the question. The point is that Saba Mahmoud is making, and that is very helpful for me, was that critical thinking often offers a diagnosis, say injustice or discrimination, but also in the same step, a prescription how to change the situation. But of course, there is much in between that, or maybe that pace goes too fast to understand how, what I call pleasures and dangers, how they coexist rather than exclude another. So that is one thing. The whole idea of an idea of the liberal subject underscores much of our work on critical thinking. And the second author I would like to point is Francis Nyamnyo, and his work on what he calls the incompleteness of life. And he makes a plea again that we should not follow binary oppositions of right and wrong, oppression, domination, and so on, but we should think of interconnections, and which is very much an anthropologist's answer, because interconnections is the very fabric of life. We are siblings, parents, children, neighbors, friends. We may sometimes disagree on things, yet we remain connected. So in a way, his plea is to go beyond binaries and to think of interconnections, and also where then contradictions logically emerge. Thirdly, I think I want to draw attention to Naminata Diabate, because what she does I find very important, and it's written in a very beautiful book. It's called Naked Agency, Genital Cursing and Biopolitics in Africa from 2020. She is, what she points at is the double outcome of what at first sight seems to be powerful structures. So she invites us to think differently about power. So in this book, she explores African women's deviant disrobing, which is what somehow it's a known, not often, there are not many studies about it, but the media typically always jumps on when groups of women threaten to undress themselves in order to bring attention to a particular injustice. So she calls that deviant disrobing. But she writes about the contradictory nature of women's agency and what she calls the paradox of progressive disrobing, because many times these women are represented as peaceful resistance, but also, and in a way, as heroines. And she I can't go too much into it, but she follows the incidences on the longer period of time than only the very particular moment of deviant disrobing. And then she shows how these women are often, rather than having agency, are actually very curtailed and always, the ones to lose out in this conflict. So she has a totally different reading from it. She speaks in that book of layers of self-contradiction, and that is, I think, is important. What she points attention at is the coexistence of what are usually seen as mutually exclusive realities. That is how power can both limit, yet also provide affordance. So that cultural institutions like marriage may be limiting, yet sometimes, and that is where you have to look carefully, they also provide affordance for example, queer sexuality. So what we often see as mutually exclusive, rather than efface them in the spirit of liberation, we should look at what may seem as a contradiction. So briefly, I think by taking these three authors together, what I learned from them is that people's lives, our lives, do not unfold in a linear, progressive, or incoherent ways that critical thinking often assumes. So we need to redirect our focus of inquiry to the messiness of life. And that includes this very everyday, daily, mundane, the vicissitudes of life, the cultural and societal contradictions in our analysis. Contradictions are, of course, difficult to think with. And such an approach sits uncomfortable with approaches featuring social injustice. And there's only so much space for nuance if you want to address discrimination and violence. Yet, I believe, bearing in mind this uneven production of knowledge, I wonder whether we should not bring in more, find an approach to harbor contradictions or ambiguities and tensions, which is in a way fairer or more accountable to life itself than only fighting in a particular way for what we call liberation. I think I'll leave it there. I went through it fast, but maybe the questions will help me explain a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That's great. I picked up on that word affordances towards the end of you speaking, because it's one of my favorite words, because I know it mainly from object studies and design, about the affordance of objects or tools, that they can be used in ways that weren't predicted by their designers. So I like the way that it talks about how things can be interpreted and they're not totally determined. So when you talk about power having affordances that allow it to be used by people who structures of authority or power might not have considered being able to use them. So I think that, and I think that runs through quite a bit of your material. There's this idea of how people are not fitting into these boxes or categories, and how they are combining attributes in unexpected ways. I also heard some things that were intersecting with that problematic around representations of Africa or representations of the South, that if you represent Africa as being, war and poverty and inequality, that fulfills a certain stereotype of it. But if you elide those real injustices and you present it as being happy and smiling and industrious, you embrace another stereotype. So I like the way that you're dealing with real material, such as the particularities of middle-class existence. Perhaps looking at middle classes, I thought, could really be revealing of global inequality, because from my experience of living in the North and living in the South, the middle classes and then much poorer people are physically closer together, and in the North they're physically further apart, but the relationships are still there. So I imagine it's an interesting lens to look through. So great, yes, thank you. And let's turn to our audience, our participants, and see if there's anybody who'd like to raise their emoji hand and ask a question or make a comment. So the floor is open for engagement. See, the divine is writing, the question of the messiness of life needs further explanation. So that to do with towards the end you were talking about, it doesn't unroll in a linear fashion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think let me give an example that so for example, for feminists or feminist analysis, heteropatriarchal society or heterosexist institutions are typically material to think with and to study. And one of these ways is, for example, marriage, which is in a way a patriarchal institution and endorsed by discourses of religion or culture or whatsoever that has very strong ideas of gender relations or the position of the woman and the position of the husband and so on, very strong gender role. So that can be studied as how the social hierarchy and how norms and values play out very differently for women than for men, and often for women in a more negative way. So that is one way to look at marriage. But if you sometimes look, there is some literature that women sometimes consciously opt for polygynous marriage, which sounds contradictory because polygyny is seen as being harmful for women or creating less space, or there are particularly negative interpretations of polygamy. Yet, when women opt for it, that should alert us that there is something else. So this is typically one of these contradictions that needs further clarity. And then there are women can quite explain that it sometimes gives them more autonomy because the man has several wives, they get their own, for example, house, and they have a lot of more space and time to live their life as they want. So in a way, there's an contradiction. We can say also here, this I could phrase it also, this is a particular affordance of a patriarchal institution of marriage that also provides opportunities or space or to carve out a different life. With the messiness of life, I think it's related to this, but also the messiness is that when we think of social injustice, we would easily think of binaries of wrong and right, but many times, as I say, homophobia goes hand in hand with care of families, of friends, and so on. So big terms like maybe homophobia or patriarchy are so generalizing that we overlook that, of course, people always also care for each other, assist another, and so on. So the messiness of life is, it may look as conflictuous or violence or whatsoever, but that's because we have learned to look at it as some kind of phenomenon, whereas in the midst of violence or whatsoever, there is of course much more also cracks in the violence or cracks in the power where people care for each other or where there is solidarity or whatsoever. And this messiness is also, I think, what I want to say with it, so partly these cracks, the unexpected cracks, but also in much of our thinking, I think there are premises of what I call this linear reasoning. That's a particular idea of progress. We fight injustice because we're working towards a better or fairer world. There's an idea of progress, of linearity, which sometimes also runs through our ideas if we study many things. But this idea of linearity presumes that easily that there are good and right things, or there are successes and failures. And then you fall back into binaries, while often they go more hand in hand. So the messiness is that people sometimes make contradictory decisions because at this very moment, this is more logical, which may turn against them in the long run, for example, or that you make a contradictory decision because of a particular situation demands that, but you will try to remedy in it in another moment. So I'm just thinking that we are always contradictory. So it's very important to have a clear object of study to see how messiness unfolds. So for example, one interview may not give us the layeredness, as Diabata calls it, to see better how things unfold. So her study on deviant disrobing seems to be a clear case of women going against patriarchal institution or injustice. But what she shows is how sometimes it backfires very much onto these women themselves, because there is not such a thing as resistance and then becoming a heroine or whatsoever. So women also make funny decisions or unwise decisions or unexpected decisions in this whole process. So I think that's more the messiness that I want to point at, that we have to look for more.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And I see my colleague Amina has her hand up. So Amina, if you're able to turn on your video, yes, here you are. Yes.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Ralph. Sorry, my dishes are behind me. I was curious about the messiness of life, and also about, perhaps if you could elaborate a bit more on how could one sit with the uncomfort of not knowing, or the uncomfort of not knowing how to access the messiness of life. Where do we enter it, especially that it's sometimes about others, and perhaps it's also about us being with others, and I'm sure it can also end up being an autoethnography. But I was just curious about how do we sit with the uncomfort of not knowing how to unfold.
Very good question, of course, because how can you know what to study if you don't know it? So this is an absolutely challenging point. I think I'm speaking here as an anthropologist, where part of our work is to invest longer periods of time studying something, or not, as I said, not just one interview, but to spend more time in a particular, I don't know what you want to call it, community or society, so that you have a particular longer durée of an issue or a controversy, or if there's a heated debate on something, that you can slowly start seeing the interconnections and so on. This also should be done in relation to, for example, if you're interested in people's life, but also how public debates unfold. And then you can see where cracks in. So people, for example, at the moment in Ghana, there's a particular bill being discussed against LGBT ways of life. And if you look at the public debates, the virulent homophobia is shocking, so to say. But having been in Ghana for a while, I also know there are communities or couples or whatever of queer sexualities or same-sex loving couples and so on, and also their environment who know. So this seems like, this is one of these cracks. How does that go together? So you cannot jump on these topics just like that, but it's about carefully unraveling something, and then it's up maybe our task to bring this seeming contradiction together and then make interpretation. But you are very right. So for example, the same-sex couples in Nairobi, if nobody studies it, they won't get known. But how do you get to know them? Well, I got to know them maybe by accident or something. So this is a bit, yeah, maybe we need to share more. We need to be more curious. So we need to be very careful about how we set up our research agendas. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina and Raquel. And Wangui, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for your presentation. It prompted me to be actually quite reflexive, because as a middle-class Kenyan, I always used to think, why on earth does anyone want to research this very boring demographic? So thank you for making me reflective, because I used to be a bit more saucy about that, because I maybe I don't see the nuance. So thank you for making me reflexive. And so that ties into my two questions. First, and not to take too much time, I think part of my hesitancy was, as a researcher, we are taught that, or we instinctively want to research something that's different from our way of life. And so I think that has to do with our own positionality, which we need to think about. So I wanted you to maybe talk about that a bit, because habitually researchers are privileged, white, middle class like me. And so that is not, maybe not so much effect of what we're told in grad school, that we need to have a research problem, but our own instinctive necessity to research different. So, so that's one question. My other question for you is, what is the middle class? Because I think I'm only asking selfishly because I have to write a paper about this, but there's a lot
These
of
are the best questions.
But in some of the literature I've been reading, as you may know, I think you actually featured in the recent Middle Class in Africa special issue in Africa. Was it Africa? I think that is being discussed. There's no, you may have actually been the convener for it. The question is, the African Development Bank will say middle class is anyone who makes more than $2 a day. This kind of inconclusive. So how do you, I mean, partially it may be in line with your interest in, these multiple layers of people and not just problems, but how do you distinguish the middle class? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your questions. Well, especially the first one is, of course, very important. I think it's more and more people like me have to question themselves, why are you studying as a white person, as a privileged European, studying people in Africa or Africans, and why you? And these are very important questions we have to address, and we have to also look at their consequences, but also at their history. So in a way, what I do, for example, in my my position in this is I study Kenya and Ghana, but I use it very much in my writing and in my teaching to use it as a mirror to look back at research practices in the global north. So, for example, I'm now, partly of what I'm telling you here today is part of a book that I hope to finish soon. That is the question, how do we study Africa and what are the effects? And rather than that it tells us something about Africa, so to say, it tells us about research agendas, about ideologies of what research is, and so on. So I want to put the gaze back to Euro-America. So that is one thing. And then how did I ever end up in studying people in Kenya or whatsoever? That is always a personal question. So, well, since the group is small here, maybe I should delve in it. I grew up in northern Nigeria in a leprosy colony, and I spent my childhood there, and then we returned to the Netherlands to further my education. So as a child, and we were the only whites, as a child, I don't know if you have children yourself, life is what it is. So returning to the Netherlands, something like this idea of race, I suddenly realized that there are differences made between so-called black and so-called white, but it didn't fit my child way of being in the world. So moreover, when I grew up, I started realizing this idea that Africans or black or other ethnicities are so different than my white ethnicity is nonsense. The family histories that I know and that we continue to be engaged with in this place in northern Nigeria reflect very much my own family history. And that is why I've come to be so interested in social mobility or in family histories. My own grandfather was rather illiterate, both my grandparents from both sides. They could read and write a little bit, but they were generally illiterate. My parents were the only of a few of their siblings who got a chance to study. And here I am this privileged person. I started in a middle class nest and lived my life. And this is also what I saw for a few families in northern Nigeria, but very much in Kenya. So that is how I came, because I thought Nairobi is a particularly interesting place. It's a regional headquarters and so on. Many things are happening. So in fact, your question, we are always interested in difference. I was so frustrated with the stereotyping picture of how people in Africa or the continent of Africa was being taught to me in university, because I thought there are more similarities rather than differences. And I think this is also what Ralph was alluding to, looking at particular things such as sexuality and middle classes may actually turn this idea around, that there are so much differences between the global south and the global north. I think there are more similarities, for example, and then these can be, middle class can typically show that, how conditions of possibilities work out for a particular group in both the north and the south. So this is basically what I think, that we should not fall into the trap that things are so different. Things are different between the Netherlands and France too, massively, if you ask me. But the similarities between me and my peers in Nairobi is bigger than between me and my family members 50 or 100 kilometers from the Netherlands, because my cousins didn't go to university. They are not so middle class as I am. We don't share the same, let's say, orientation in life, which I do with my peers in Nairobi. I don't know, does this answer your question?
Yes, Owango is replying by text.
Thank you, Rachel. My electricity's just gone out. Otherwise, I would show you my face. Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Owango. That's a bit of particularity coming in there with your electricity going out. Fortunately, we're outside of load shedding at the moment. But thank you very much for that response, Rachel. That was really elucidating. And yeah, I think that finding commonality is very important, and recognizing hybridity as well across different locations. Azar, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, Rachel. I remember I read your paper about the middle class Nairobian middle class professionals and the intimacy, and I remember it's like one of the papers I was really fascinated about.
Thank you.
Yes, I thought it was refreshing. Yes, as you said, it's somehow brought a different perspective of a group that it's hardly studied. Also, I mean, it's also relative to see how it's hardly studied, because I mean, if you look at, I mean, it's not, there's a lot of literature that's not published in English, it's in Arabic, but it's about middle class in Sudan, for example, and it's also about the bourgeois. We had like a very interesting book written by a Sudanese scholar who wrote about the bourgeois, the parasital bourgeois, who this kind of the kind of group that came out of the rentier economy, and like profiting on property without giving back to the community. So this is why the phrase of parasital bourgeois, And I think, yes, I think when we have to, somehow find a way of bridging the gap. I think it's more of there's studies out there, but it's just we don't speak to each other. These studies don't really, for many reasons. It could be reasons of language. It could be reasons of publishing. Publishing beyond the countries where we are. It's also could be. There are a lot of reasons. The acknowledgement even of the African scholars or scholars on the continent is not like that big, but I could, if you ask me, I could state a lot of research about what's done in Sudan. Also, there was, I was watching a talk last, just to reflect on Wangui's question. I was watching a talk last week, and there was an activist who was talking about how the youth, it was about the youth, the youth who were participating in the revolution in Sudan. And then the youth were somehow dismissed when it came to, power sharing, and after the fall of Bashir. And she had this very interesting description about, okay, what kind of youth now is brought to the image, to attract the donor, international donors, always this kind of cute middle class youth, the one who speaks English, dressed nicely, and she actually framed it, the cute middle class professional. So these are the ones that are now brought kind of in the image, and the people or the youth who are in the frontier, the one who are going out and being beaten by the police are not there. Yeah. So it's just I wanted to say this interesting way of also describing what's the middle class, okay, the cute young professional, the one who speaks English, because English somehow also gives you a kind of status and privilege in a context where a lot of people don't speak English. So it's a kind of way to access some sort of status, a prestige. So this is one way, I think, to see middle classes. And there is, I remember at the University of Bayreuth, there's this research about the middle classes in Africa, and it's, I'm sure you know about it. And they came with this idea of milieux. Instead of saying middle classes, they're talking about milieux, how it's not just about economic status, but it's also about your religious beliefs. It's also about where you hang out, how cool you are, these kind of things. So it's just, there's no question. It's just reflecting on that. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I realize, Wangui, I didn't respond to your next question. Sorry about that, or your second question. And thank you, Aza. I think you are really raising important questions. I think what is also clear, what you are saying is we should be very careful with the term middle class. Actually, it's a misnomer. That's the whole problem. So in a way, I wish we couldn't use it because it has connotations that do not fit many societies. It's being misused by, for example, global media, feeding different meanings into it. So it's a very problematic term. And also this whole idea of the new African middle classes is a total misfit because they've always been middle classes. So I think if we start writing or thinking about a middle class, the first thing is there is no such thing as the middle class. So for me as an anthropologist, I say I'm not buying into these very economic interpretations of how salaries are measured and so on, because they don't work. First of all, many people with a salary will have side jobs, having a taxi, having getting extra money in, or land and so on. So that focus on salary doesn't help us. And because if you talk of the moment you talk of middle class, you suggest a layeredness of society, which is not helpful at all. Society is not neatly organized into groups or layers. So maybe, so that is why the term milieu works better. Also, particularly the notion of milieu helps because they speak of orientation in life. And I think that is also what I do. But as an anthropologist, I say I study the middle classes as a particular kind of cultural practice, which is indeed about shared norms and values, about lifestyle matters, and so on. Yet, from what is important for me is to distinguish what I've been talking about as the wealthier groups, because obviously many there are huge groups who are poor, who are struggling, whose daily lives is a struggle for food, for water, and so on. That is so we in that sense I want to distinguish from those who are relatively wealthy, who have don't have to worry about their housing, who have a regular income, and so on. And then from there on, other things can happen. So it's rough, it's difficult to define the middle class. I wouldn't start going there, but describe the group that you are interested in. So there's something about this and having money at the disposal, being able to invest in education, and so on. There are a few things, I think, like characteristics, lifestyle issues, that then you can show something like maybe a particular group or middle group. But what I think, Asa, what you are pointing at is really, really, really extremely difficult, and I don't know the solution for that. If we talk about the production of knowledge, we should also pay attention to the problem of the dominance of Anglophone language in the what we call scholarship. That's a terrible thing. So, for example, the difference between Anglophone and Francophone African societies, these are two separate bodies of literature. That's a total loss of knowledge, of information. You raise the matter of all the things that are written in Arabic. I have no access to it. So it's not by choice, but of course I would need them, but I have no idea what to do with it. So this is an absolute challenge for the future and maybe for the AASA. This is something we should need to work on to have a more inclusive production of knowledge. And also we are all, I think, well, except for a few, we are all non-native English speakers. In the Netherlands, we don't speak English until we go to secondary school and university. So the effort to learn English and then to write about it, and so much gets lost if we don't also rely on the other languages. So it is a real problem, yeah.
Thank you very much for that response, Rachel. And thanks, Azza, for your questions and comments. And yeah, we are just about exactly on 6 o'clock now. So that's been a really stimulating presentation and conversation. So thank you very much. I'm really glad that you could make it, Rachel, and we were very happy to wait for you. So that's absolutely our pleasure. Yes. Good work.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to add, I can see all of the questions too. There's so much more to discuss. But yeah, I hope we will meet in the future and share some more thoughts. But thank you for this chance.
Yeah, I can see a lot of comments coming in from
yes, I will read them.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for everybody's presence.
Yeah, thanks to Humor for hosting this seminar. This was an attire seminar, and thanks everyone for attending and for participating, taking part. Good night.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Ralph, can you